Good morning.
Oh,
Welcome to Sanford Occupational Medicine webinars. I'm Dr. Joel Blanchard. I'm the medical director for Sanford's Occupational Medicine Clinic. And our topic today is the FMCSA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. As you have heard, the Federal Motor Carriers Administration is going to implement some new regulations starting January 6th of 2020. So the purpose and my objectives today is to outline why the FMCSA has established a clearinghouse. I will define who is affected by this regulation, and it will outline the responsibilities of the employer or motor carrier, the driver, the medical review officer, which I'll refer to as the MRO, and the consortium third-party administrator, and also a substance abuse professional, the SAP. Please note that this presentation will take about an hour, and there'll be some time left at the end for some questions and answers. And you could see either at the top or bottom of your screen a Q&A section where you can ask your questions, and I'll answer them as after the presentation is over. So first of all, the FMCSA Clearinghouse will be a secure database which will contain real-time information about commercial driver license and commercial learner's permit holders' drug and alcohol program violations. Okay, so real-time, any violation they have will be placed on this database. And this clearinghouse can be accessed by employers, by the FMCSA themselves, by state drivers licensing agencies, and state law enforcement personnel. Once it goes live on January 6th of 2020. Please note that this is starting on January 6th, so there will be no information right at the start, but each day new information will be added of violations, and after several years there will be a great source of information for the people who access the clearinghouse. So what will the clearinghouse contain? It'll contain records of violation of alcohol and drug that is prohibited according to 49 CFR Part 382 Subpart B. So basically it will be positive drug and alcohol test results and also alcohol and drug test refusals. It will also contain, besides the violations of the driver, it will contain information on whether the driver has completed the return to duty process and whether they have completed the follow-up testing plan. So the FMCSA's purpose is to maintain records of all the drug and alcohol violations in a single database. Okay. It will also require that all employers check the database to make sure that current and new employees have not incurred drug or alcohol violations that would prohibit them from performing safety-sensitive functions covered by the FMCSA regulations. Okay, so we'll have all the information, and it requires that employers check to make sure that their current drivers and new drivers are not prohibited from driving. So this tool will allow identification of drivers who are prohibited from driving a commercial motor vehicle and ensure that these drivers receive the required evaluation and treatment before resuming safety-sensitive duties. So this will prevent drivers from hiding their violations from their new employers by moving to a new employer or a new state. So the drug and alcohol violations will follow the driver no matter how many times they change employers or apply for a CDL in a different state. And the reason this was put in place is that it was about 20 years ago, there was a bus crash in Louisiana where I believe 22 people were killed. And the driver had not revealed to their current employer, this new employer, that they'd have previous alcohol and drug violations. The driver did not go through the process of evaluation and treatment and just went to work, and of course was under the influence of alcohol and drugs, crashed and caused the death of all these people. So this led to the clearinghouse being established here. Of note is that the final rule for the clearinghouse does not change any existing requirements in the US DOT procedures for transportation, drug, and alcohol testing. So in other words, the rules on who you test, how you test them, how often you test them does not change. It just changes the fact that these violations must be reported to the clearinghouse, and the employer must check on the clearinghouse if someone has any violations. So who's affected by this new regulation? Well, the drivers are, the employers or motor carriers, the MROs, the substance abuse professional, and TPAs or third-party administrators. So these 5 groups must register with the clearinghouse, and registration has already begun this month. At the website listed below, which is clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov, / you can sign up for updates and actually register at that site. And I would suggest that everybody start registering for those. And I'll explain to you what happens when you register here. So, okay. So we'll go through the responsibilities of the individual groups. So the employer responsibilities. As a motor carrier, this is what you must do. You must register with the clearinghouse. And once you've registered, you must use the clearinghouse to conduct a full query of the clearinghouse as part of each pre-employment driver investigation. So currently, when you have a new driver, a new employee, you must ask them who their employers have been for the last 3 years. You're required to contact all these employers and ask them if they've had any drug or alcohol violations. And you also must see if they have completed the required treatment and assessment. So now you'll still have to do that for the next 3 years because you need to go back 3 years, but after 3 years, the clearinghouse will contain all the information that you need to do, okay? So you must conduct a full inquiry, it's called a query, as part of a pre-employment driver investigation. Now, secondly, you must conduct what's called a limited query at least annually for every driver they employ. So on employment, you do a full query, and then annually for all your drivers, you must do a limited query. Now, for the full query, you must request electronic consent from the driver before you can do so, okay? So on pre-employment, you need to get the consent to do this. And then also the employer, besides querying it to see if your employers have a violation, you must report drug and alcohol program violations to the clearinghouse. So these are the results that you have to place on to the clearinghouse. A negative return to work, a negative return to duty test result must be placed by the employer on the clearinghouse. You must record it there. You must also record the date of the successful completion of a follow-up testing plan for any driver they employ who had unresolved drug and alcohol program violations. In other words, when there's a negative test, you need to put it on there, and once they've completed their whole return to duty process and follow-up testing, you need to state that that's completed. So if that driver, if they get employed by someone else, they'll query and say they've had a violation, but they've completed all the testing, and they're now fit to return to the safety-sensitive duty of driving a commercial motor vehicle. It's important to note also that the employer can delegate assistance and when they register at the clearinghouse, and then they can manage them online through the clearinghouse. They can also select a TPA and manage them on the clearinghouse. And as you'll see, the TPA can perform a lot of the duties that are required of the employer. Now, owner-operators fit into a special class. They are required to select a TPA to manage the clearinghouse requirements. If you're a motor carrier and you have employees, obviously you can search and you have objective determination as to what to do with this. But if you're also the owner and the operator, you need someone external to you to manage the clearinghouse requirements, to make sure that there's no, incorrect information added or not included into the database at the clearinghouse. The cost of the queries from the FMCSA is at a rate of $1.25 a query. And no matter if you buy 1 or 1,000 of them, they're $1.25 a query. And the employer must purchase those. If you have a TPA acting on your behalf, you as the employer must buy and pay for those queries, and then your TPA can act on your behalf, but the TPA cannot purchase or pay for these queries. Now, besides doing the query and able to assign assistants and TPAs, the employer has responsibilities to report violations. And the employer must report these violations by the close of the 3rd business day following the date they obtain the following information. So as an example, today we're Wednesday, October 23rd. So the close of the 3rd business day would be, one day is Thursday, October 24th, Friday, October 25th, 26, 27 doesn't count. So Monday, the 28th, at the close of the day, you must report the following information. You must report an alcohol confirmation test with a concentration of 0.04 or greater. You must also report a refusal to take an alcohol test as required by regulation. You must report a negative return to duty test result and a refusal to test in accordance to the regulation. And the reason that the FMCSA placed this responsibility on the employer is that these 4 violations do not go through an MRO. They're done, and the result is sent to the employer, and the employer is responsible to report those to the clearinghouse. A negative return to duty test is not reported by the MRO to the clearinghouse because it's negative. So, and a refusal to test that's determined by the employer is required to be reported to the FMCSA clearinghouse by the employer. So again, alcohol levels above 0.0 equal to or greater than 0.4 must be reported, refusal to take an alcohol test, and negative return to duty test result, and a refusal to test in accordance to the regulation. And the employer must also report that the driver has completed all follow-up tests as prescribed by the SAP. Okay, there's other duties that the employer has. So again, this is at the close of the 3rd business day on which the employer obtains actual knowledge of. So if you obtain actual knowledge of on-duty alcohol use, if you obtain information on pre-duty alcohol use following an accident, and a controlled substance use. Any of these things, again, must be reported by the close of the 3rd business day when you obtain actual knowledge of this. As you report those, you must provide documentation on these events to prove that this actually occurred. So let's say there's use of alcohol on duty. There will be a form that you need to fill out which shows documentation that this has actually occurred. Same with pre-duty alcohol use following an accident, or use of controlled substance. So the FMCSA will provide the information that is required to document these properly. One thing that's come up is when a medical examiner does a DOT examination to issue a certificate, often the long form is submitted to the employer or motor carrier. On that history, there may be mention that the driver is using medical marijuana. And the FMCSA has confirmed that information on there is not to be construed as actual knowledge of use, which seems unusual, but there is a specific mention that that is not actual knowledge of use of a controlled substance. So use of controlled substance would be that, someone states that I was with the driver and this is what happened, or you witnessed them using some controlled substance, or the driver admits to using controlled substance. So the information on the long form for a DOT exam is not considered to be actual knowledge of. Okay, so employer responsibilities. So when you do a limited query, which would be for your employers on an annual basis, all that you will get there is it will state that there is information on this driver in the clearinghouse or there is not. If there is information, the employer must conduct a full query within 24 hours of doing this limited query. So let's say you do a limited query on a driver today at about 10:15, October 23rd. By 10:15, October 24th, you must have conducted a full query. And in order to do the full query, you need to obtain consent of the driver. So this is a specific consent that must be uploaded up to the clearinghouse before you can do the full query. Unlike the limited query, where you can get a general consent at the time of employment, which states that you will perform a limited query on an annual basis. Now, be careful in how you word your policy on that or your consent, because you may decide that you want to do this query, this limited query, more than once a year, but you must do it at least once a year. So you may say that we will do a limited query. You're consenting for me to be able to do a limited query on you, Mr. Commercial motor vehicle driver, at least once a year. Now, the reason they have the 24-hour limited query is it gives you time to reach your driver, obtain the consent, and upload it up to the clearinghouse. Now, if you're unable to perform the full query because you're unable to get the consent from the driver within 24 hours, the employer must not allow the driver to perform any safety-sensitive duties until the full query is done and the results show that the driver is able to perform safety-sensitive duties such as driving a commercial motor vehicle. So if it shows that there's some information on the clearinghouse with a limited query, consent from the driver within 24 hours, do a full query and see what this is. It may be that they've had a violation, but they've met all the requirements, and so they're able to drive. Or it may show that, no, they had a alcohol or drug violation and they have not sought the help of an SAP to get through the testing and the evaluation and to set up a treatment plan. And therefore, they are not allowed to do safety-sensitive duties until this evaluation and treatment has been performed. So again, full query, annual basis, general consent works for that. Once you do that, if there's something on the clearinghouse from the driver within 24 hours, you need to get consent, upload it to the clearinghouse, do a full query, and determine if they're allowed to work or not. The limited query, general consent can last for multiple years. A full query needs a consent on each occasion. So employer responsibilities as well is, this is nothing new. You must develop and maintain a policy and provide education to new and current drivers on the misuse of drugs and alcohol and the consequences of that. So that's not new. But what is new is in that policy and in that education, you must include notification to your drivers that information on the drug and alcohol violations will be reported to the clearinghouse. So that language must be included in your policy and education to your new and current drivers. Okay, driver responsibilities. So again, the driver must register with the clearinghouse. The driver must consent to full query requests when an employer asks for it. Once a drug or alcohol violation occurs and the driver enters the return to duty process, they select the SAP. The employer is not the one who selects the SAP. It is the driver who selects the SAP. And until the driver has selected this specific SAP, there's nothing through the SAP process that can start. Now, if an owner-operator Just again, the owner operator, it's a special situation. They're both the motor carrier and the driver. They must select a TPA to manage the clearinghouse reporting requirements related to drug and alcohol violations. And the other thing that's different for the driver is that in the past, when you've gone for a drug test, often the identification that you've used would have been potentially a social security number or a employer ID number, but now they will be required to do a CDL license number and state of issuance at the time of drug collection. And the reason for that is that even if the driver does not register with the clearinghouse, the information on them will be placed on the clearinghouse if there's a violation. And as someone queries this, this will show up. So if the driver is supposed to register, but if they don't, if there's a violation, that information will be entered because of them providing the license number and the state of issuance. Now, it's important to note that the driver themselves may query the clearinghouse at any time to review the record, and there's no cost for that. So the driver can look at that as many times as they want to see if there's something listed on their name at the clearinghouse. Now, there's a safety procedure that's been placed in by the clearinghouse. So if the driver finds that there's some incorrect information on the clearinghouse, that can be changed by providing appropriate documentation supporting the requested change. Some examples may be that someone has been charged with a DUI that may show up on there. If that's incorrect, they can provide the documentation that that's not occurred. Now, whether someone is found guilty or not when they have their DUI trial, apparently the information still remains on the clearinghouse. So even if someone is charged with a DUI and the case is shown to be not guilty, there could be some problems with that. But if your name is on there and you've never had a DUI, you can provide that information as a driver, and the documentation supporting that will make the request change. And then the incorrect information will be removed from the clearinghouse. Okay, so let's now go on to TPAs, or third-party administrators. So again, the TPA must register with the clearinghouse before any employer can designate them to access the clearinghouse on their behalf. So the TPA registers first, and as the employer registers, they can designate the TPA to act on their behalf. So if any of you have registered already and you have not selected a TPA, that availability is there now. So for instance, if you're selecting Sanford Occupational Medicine Drug Testing as your TPA for this, we've registered on site, and you can select us as your TPA and we can act on your behalf. We can't say that, yes, we're going to access on behalf of company X. We can't choose the company must choose the TPA. So again, no TPA can enter information into the clearinghouse on the employer's behalf unless the employer has designated them to do so. And once they've been designated by the employer, the TPA can basically do the same things that the employer can. It can request a driver consent for full query. It may query the driver violation information, and it can report drug and alcohol violations as per the regulations. So same things. It can report negative return to duty test results. It can report on completion of follow-up testing. And again, the reporting time frame for reporting is the same as the employer, the close of the third business day following the date they obtain the information. And when they say they, that is that the employer has received this information. So as an employer, if you receive information and you send it to the TPA, 2 days and 22 hours after it happened, the TPA only has 2 hours to enter it onto the website, onto the clearinghouse. So again, if you designate a TPA and you get some new information about this, you need to send it to your TP as soon as possible so they can meet the 3rd business day deadline. The other thing that I mentioned earlier, but I just want to reiterate, is that the TPA cannot purchase clearinghouse queries. They must be purchased by the employer. So when the TPA is acting on the company's behalf, on the employer's behalf, if there's been no purchased queries, the TPA won't be able to do the querying. So the employer must buy those. They're just available, and the TPA or some of their designated assistants will be able to do the query. And again, I think this is an important point. The final responsibility for clearinghouse entries and queries remains with the employer. So in other words, if the TPA or one of your assistants messes up and doesn't do things as they should, the person who is responsible for the violation is the employer. Let's talk now about the MRO. So again, the MRO is the medical review officer who reviews drug testing results. So again, we must register with the clearinghouse, and our MROs have already registered for that, and there's no need for the company to choose an MRO and whatnot. These are 2 separate tracks. MROs must register. And as an MRO, when I review a drug test, I am responsible for reporting the following. If there's a positive test, if there's an adulterated or a substituted test, I must report those to the clearinghouse as an MRO. Whenever I determine that there's a refusal to test, which is different reasons than what an employer does, I also have to report those to the clearinghouse. I think this is a good time to talk about refusal to test. So let's say that an employer sends an employee or driver to do a drug screen, and as they go to the collection site, there may be some unusual behavior. There may be using of a device to cheat the test. The urine may be out of range for temperature. The color may be weird. The smell may be weird, or they are unable to give a sample and they leave the collection site before the 3 hours are up. So at that time, the collector determines that there is a refusal to test. They send that information to the DER, the designated employer representative, and the employer then has the responsibility of accepting what the collector determined, and the employer, the DER, can ask for documentation from the collector to see if they agree that this is a refusal to test. So in that instance, the MRO is not involved. It's communication between the collector and the employer, and then the employer makes the determination that this is a refusal to test. So that's an employer responsibility to report that to the clearinghouse. Versus, as an MRO, someone is unable to provide enough urine at a collection site. They do wait the 3 hours. They may drink up to 40 ounces of water, and in spite of that, they aren't able to provide a sample. Then as an MRO, I have the donor go for a medical examination to see if there's a medical explanation for them not being able to provide a urine sample. If there is no legitimate medical explanation, I deem that a refusal to test. So that's when I, as an MRO, would report that to the clearinghouse. So you see the 2 differences there of refusal to test. When it's employer determined, they are responsible to report it to the clearinghouse. When it's MRO determined, the MRO is responsible to report that to the clearinghouse. As an MRO, we don't report any canceled tests, because canceled tests are not a violation, so those will not show up on there. And also, I think it's important time to say as well that the information on this clearinghouse will only be violations related to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So, commercial motor vehicle drivers. So it does not apply to the FAA, the mass transit, railway, etc. This is strictly for FMCSA. So that brings up another point. When the employer queries previous employers, and it's been 3 years that the clearinghouse is there, just strictly looking at what's in the clearinghouse will satisfy any needs to investigate past employers. But if they've worked for other agencies besides the FMCSA, Railroad, FAA, Mass Transit, you still have to ask for those employers' input on whether someone has a violation or not. So getting back to the MRO, must register. This is what we report to the clearinghouse. And then we must report those within 2 business days of when we verify the drug test. So again, as an example, today is October 23rd. I verify someone at 3 o'clock this afternoon. By 3 o'clock, Friday the 25th, I must have sent this on to the clearinghouse. Now, occasionally we make a verification and we determine that the decision we made because of new information is incorrect, and we can make a change to our final result. So for instance, if there is a positive result sent to you because someone is on hydrocodone and they are unable to provide me with the prescription to prove that they are taking it, you know, as a legitimate prescription, I call it a positive. Now, let's say they say, okay, I have a prescription now. I couldn't get it to you in time, but now I do. I may then say, okay, this is a legitimate explanation for this, so this is now a negative test. So as I change my verification, I must make the change on the clearinghouse within 1 business day of making the result change. So the other responsibility that we have is if on the CCF, a control of custody form, the driver did not include their license number and state of issuance, we must ask for that. And then when we submit this to the clearinghouse, we'll include that information on there as well. So there's several checks on that. So the employer will tell the driver, you must provide your CDL license number and state of issuance when you go for the drug test. The collector will insist on it as well. If they don't, you still do the test. And when the MRO gets back a positive result and that they have to report that to the clearinghouse, they will ask for a CDL license number and state of issuance. If we are unable to do so, we'll contact the employer and state that there's a problem with this and that we need to obtain the driver's license, the CDL license number and the state of issuance in order to be able to upload that to the clearinghouse. Because again, the driver may try and fool the system by saying, I'm not going to identify myself, so they can't put my information in the clearinghouse. Well, the motor carrier should have the CDL license number, state of issuance of their drivers, etc. So there's a lot of checks to make sure that no one can cheat the system. So again, we enter these violations to the clearinghouse, even if the driver is not registered on the clearinghouse, like I mentioned earlier. The driver may just say, I'm not going to register, so then they can't put information on there. But once we have the driver's license number and the state of issuance, we can, and that violation will be attributed to the driver. We may also, as MROs, assign assistants to enter information on our behalf to the clearinghouse. Okay, the SAP, the Substance Abuse Professional. Their responsibilities, again, must register with the clearinghouse. Again, they must be selected by the driver before entering any information on the clearinghouse. The employer can't select it for them. They can suggest people, give them a list of who to go to, but the driver must select them. And once they do that, then the SAP can report identification of the driver and date the initial assessment was initiated. They'll report that on the clearinghouse. They will also report successful completion of treatment and or education and the determination of the driver's eligibility for return to duty testing. So they will basically say, person has now, the driver's come in, we're starting the assessment, and now I've completed my treatment and education. And so from my perspective, I'm done with the SAP, and now they can start the return to duty testing. And of course, a negative return to duty testing will be reported by the employer to the clearinghouse. And again, the SAP must report the day following the determination that the driver has completed the return to duty process. And they may also assign assistants. Okay, so I see that there's a lot of questions. So I've gone through the information that I have, and I just want to summarize some of the points that I've made. So all employers must perform full query of the clearinghouse for new hires as part of the hiring process, and at minimum, limited queries on current employees at least once annually. So if you send someone in for a DOT as a new hire, you may ask the clinic that's performing this to also, if you've listed them as the TPA, to perform a full query on your behalf. And then once that query is obtained, you can get the consent from the driver. That information can be relayed to you as the motor carrier. There will be a specific consent again for that new hire for a full query. And again, you can get a general consent to, at a minimum, perform a limited query on current employees at least once annually. Make sure you don't limit yourself to one annually. You can say at least once annually in case you want to do it more often. Again, employers can designate assistants and TPAs to perform those duties. TPAs can't say, I want to be the TPA for company X. Company X must choose the TPA. And be aware that the employer maintains the final responsibility for the actions of the assistants and the TPAs. So as a TPA, we mess up or the assistants mess up, the employer is the one who will get the brunt of not meeting the requirements of this new regulation. The employers must also resolve violations to the clearinghouse within 3 business days of obtaining knowledge of these. So again, we listed what those are, and the rules don't change on what is a violation, who you test, how often you test, etc. When you have a return to duty process, there's no change on what you need to do. The only change is that you must report them to the clearinghouse within 3 business days of obtaining knowledge of these. And again, drivers must register with the clearinghouse, and owner operators must designate TPAs to fulfill the duties required for the clearinghouse. Again, as owner operator, you're the motor carrier, and the employee, you're the driver. So to prevent any possible fraud, you must designate a TPA to fulfill the duties required for the clearinghouse. Okay, so we have time for some questions here. So I see we have a lot of questions here. So let's, okay, so the first question is, will a copy of the PowerPoint presentation be available? The answer is yes. So following this webinar, we'll send out an evaluation of this webinar, and I'd appreciate if you would fill this out so we can do a better job for future webinars. And then once the webinar is uploaded to our website, we will send a second email with a link directly to that presentation. Okay, so it'll be available at sanfordocmed.com, but there's a specific site on there for these presentations we have, and we will include the link on the second email we send to you. Okay, so the second question is this. Drivers are not required to sign up at this time, but as an employer, we will run annual queries. If a driver is not signed up, but has an event related to drug and alcohol failure, is it possible to get information to the system where we, as an employee, will see in the limited query that would in turn require us to run the full query, which require the driver to sign up and approve our full query? Okay. So again, I think I've answered that question, is that the drivers need to register, but if they are trying to fool the system by not, as an employer, you can just say you need to do so, but if there's a violation, it will still be placed on to the clearinghouse based on their driver's license number, their CDL license number, and the state of issuance. And as you query them, even if they haven't registered, that event will show up with a limited query. And then once you do that, you need to get a consent. And once that occurs, if the person does not want to consent because they don't want to register, then you must take them off duty. Okay. The second question is, I've set up our clearinghouse account and it said we have to sync with our FMCSA portal. But when I go there, I see no link to make this connection. So in order to set up your Clearinghouse account, you'd have to have a government login. And so I'm not sure if I have an answer for that. So I don't know the answer and how you link that to the FMCSA portal. So you got to make sure that you have a government login information. And then once you have that, you would be able to access the Clearinghouse. And once you have that, you can register. And at that time, you can designate who are your assistants and who could be your TPA. Okay, so next question is, I have an employee who recently quit after testing positive. He did not contact an SAP or participate in any follow-up. Do I need to enter this information into the Clearinghouse? So if this has happened currently, you can't enter it into the Clearinghouse. So I've checked into this, and the Clearinghouse goes live on January 6th of 2020. And then from that point on, you will need to register. So for instance, this person had a positive test, let's say it was on January 6th or 7th, the MRO would have uploaded the positive result to the FMCSA. So that employee, that driver would then have a record on there. There's no need to enter something from the past, but if another employer asks you if there's a violation, then of course you're required to say yes. Okay, and that same question, when we'll be able to upload? January 6th of 2020. So the Clearinghouse will not have information from the past. It's starting brand new on January 6th. So at 1 second after midnight on January 6th, there'll be no information on there, and each day more and more information will be added. So in other words, its value the first few months will probably not be a lot except for new violations. That's why the employer must still ask for previous employers and ask those employers if there's been a violation, and if so, have they completed the education and testing. So again, January 6th is the date. Okay, if an employee has a Class A commercial driver's license and has a DUI in their personal vehicle, does the employer need to enter this information at Clearinghouse? So again, the rules have been changed on that. If you have actual knowledge and documentation that the person has an alcohol violation, this information should be entered by the driver and can be entered by the employer if they have the proper documentation to prove that this has happened. Again, yes, it will be sent. Copy of the slides, you'll be able to get those as well. Okay, the question is, what is this C/TPA again? So C/TPA stands for Consortium Third-Party Administration. So this is someone who you may, as a company yourself, have us as your TPA. So we manage your random testing and those sorts of things. So an added feature to that is, as a TPA, third-party administrator, we can perform your duties to fulfill the requirements of the Clearinghouse. Okay, next question is, if the employee refuses to take the test to their supervisor prior to getting the collection, if the employer refuses to take the test to their supervisor prior to getting the collection facility. So I think the question is, if you let's say it's reasonable suspicion or there's an accident and you told the driver they must go for a test at the collection facility on such and such a date at such and such a time. If they go there before you're there and they refuse, that's a violation. If they don't show up and you show up, that's a violation. And that is something that the employer must record to the Clearinghouse. Okay. How are we going to get the previous employer's information? The previous employer did not test, was not required to test. So again, there's no change in the regulations. As it is right now, as an employer, when you get a new employee, you are supposed to ask the employer of the employee of any previous employers for the last 3 years, and you are supposed to contact these employers and see if there's been any violation. So, all right, here's a question. What if I want to do a full or partial query on a driver that is not registered? So again, if you have the CDL license number and state of issuance, you can query an employer. You can do a partial query if you have general consent. If you do a full query, you need a actual consent for that. So are all drivers required to register Clearinghouse or only operators? Both. Drivers are required to, and so are owner operators. Okay, can you provide a copy of the presentation to employers? So again, the presentation will be on our website, and you can definitely share those with your employees. Okay, so the next question is an important one, and I don't have the answer for it yet. So is there required a suggested consent form? From my understanding, and I haven't seen this yet, that the Clearinghouse will have a designated consent form that you can download and have the driver sign and upload back to the Clearinghouse. Now, I have not seen that yet, but that is their intent. Can an employer mandate their drivers to enter the information of the Clearinghouse? Can employers bring the employee in and enter the drivers in the Clearinghouse for the driver with the driver there? So the employee are the ones who must register. So you can mandate that as part of your policy. And if you can, you know, it doesn't matter where they do it as long as they perform it. So you can certainly have them come in and do that. Okay, we are a construction company. I have only 2 drivers that drive part-time moving equipment. Do we have to join the Clearinghouse program? Okay, so the answer is if someone needs a DOT exam and meets the requirement for needing a CDL to do their job, you must take part in the Clearinghouse program. It's the regulation that you register, have your driver register, and that you do a full query on employment and an annual query limited after that. What will drivers and employees get notice from the DOT that they also have to sign up? So the FMCSA has been sending emails to employers, to MROs, to drivers. So they're sending notice. So what do employers do with 4 DOT numbers and drivers drive for employers, different companies and queries? So again, you have to treat each individual motor carrier and driver separately. So the drivers only have to register once, but the employer, if they have several numbers, they may have to use the different DOT numbers for that. Okay, the question is, with a limited query comes back as having information, must the driver be removed from safety sensitive function immediately? So the answer is you have 24 hours. So you do a limited query and there's something on there, you have 24 hours to contact the driver, get the consent, and do a full query. And if you're unable to do so, you must take him off duty at that time, after the 24 hours. You can choose to do it before if you want, but within 24 hours, if you can't get a consent, then you must take him off duty. Okay. So if a current driver is in the middle of their follow-up testing schedules by January 20, will we need to send the negative result receipts for tests done prior to this date? You start reporting negatives. No, you start reporting negatives as of January 6th of 2020. Okay, the question is, if we designate Sanford Occupational as our TPA, will Sanford Occupational assist on updating our policy? We definitely can give you some advice on what to put in there. Okay. Okay, here's a question. If someone tests positive for a different company during the year, will there be an email sent to the company saying they have something on their profile? So if it's after January 26th, reporting that to the Clearinghouse is fulfilling all the requirements of an employer. They don't have to notify anybody else of it. They can if they want to, but going to the Clearinghouse is it fulfills your requirement. Now, if you know that someone is working for someone else and you want to share that information, I don't think there's a problem with that. So in other words, reporting to the clearinghouse fulfills your requirements. Okay, we have an FRA employee with CDL duties also. He drives DOT and random pool is FRA, but driving random pool is positive. Can I report to the clearinghouse? So you only report to the clearinghouse violations that occur under the auspices of the FMCSA. So if you have a violation under the railroad program, that does not get reported to the clearinghouse. Only violations that occur while driving as a FMCSA driver do you report. I suspect that future enhancements for this program will be to include all the transportation agencies, but the FMCSA is starting this. Okay, if a collection occurs on December 31st and the result is not reviewed and verified until January 6th, does that test get reported as the collection? No, okay. So as an MRO, let's say that someone does a urine collection on December 31st, and then I review the tests, takes a while to get the results back. I have a hard time reaching the driver, and I make my verification on January 7th. Yes, I will report that to the clearinghouse. Now, if on December 31st, there is, you know, some, you know, bad action at the collection site, or the driver leaves without completing the collection, and you're notified on December 31st of that, you of course record it to yourself for your own records. So if someone asks you for violations, you have it, but you don't report that to the clearinghouse. It must occur on or after January 6th. Okay, someone wants clarification of what we must include in education for drug and policy for new hires. So first of all, you got to talk about the effects of drug and alcohol use, of misuse, and then you must tell them that moving forward from January 6th on, you will report drug and alcohol violations to the clearinghouse. So that's the new part. Before, you had to educate them on the adverse effects of drug use. But now you must also educate them on the fact that you will report violations to the clearinghouse. If an employee self-reports they have a drug and alcohol problem, how do we report that with no documentation until they see an SAP? So self-reporting to the employer is actual knowledge that this has occurred, and then the employer can report that. And then the employee will designate an SAP and they'll start that process. Okay, if a TPA reports a positive test, why does the employer have to do it also? Okay, so as a TPA, the third-party administrator, they are there to determine who gets tested, when they get tested on a random pool. They don't necessarily get the report back. It usually goes to the employer. So it depends on the relationship that you have with the TPA. If your results go to your TPA and then come to you, that's a different relationship. But most times the MRO reports directly to the employer. So that's why the employer must report to the TPA. And again, question is, clearinghouse is just for CDL drivers, just for FMCSA drivers. If someone is a non-CDL, not under, doesn't need a DOT exam and whatnot, no, that's not reported to the clearinghouse. Can a business have multiple TPAs? Yes. Depending, you know, if you're all over the country, you may have 3 TPAs, 10 TPAs, yes. If you are an owner operator and an employer, do you have to register twice? So in the registration process to that website that I gave you, you would register. So in other words, you are an owner, but you're an operator for your company, but you also have employees. So you actually function both. So you must register as an employer and as an owner operator. Okay. As a college that is non-DOT regulated, we prepare students for the workforce. We require some programs to mandate students to receive a CDL license. So if someone falls under the auspices of a DOT where they will be operating under the FMCSA, get a DOT exam, need a medical certificate, these people must register. Okay, we have employees who do not have a CDL when hired, but they get one later. Do we have to drug test them twice? We do pre-employment drug screen. So if you are hired as a new driver, it would be the right thing to do is to do a pre-employment drug screen, and at that time do a full query on this individual because they're new to this position. Okay, so so the question is, do we run queries on students? If they have a learner's permit, you must query on them. So there's a lot of questions on on whether you need to register if they're, if it's under 10,000 or over 2,000 but don't need a CDL. So it's just whenever they're designated to be a commercial motor vehicle driver under the requirements of the DOT, then you need to register. Did you say we have to report all negatives as well as positives? So no. So a positive result that's determined by the MRO will be reported by the MRO. The employer must only report negatives in the return to duty testing, because the MRO won't report a negative test at any time. But if it's a return to duty test, the employer must report those. They don't report positives, that's the MRO. They only report violations that we listed during the presentation. If we lay off employees over the winter, do we have to do a full query when they return to work in spring, or just a limited query annually? I don't know the answer to that. That will be a question that you should ask of the clearinghouse. Does the company get notice that their employees tested positive throughout the year? So again, if you're the employer and one of your employees, you send them for a drug test, you will get a result back from the MRO saying that it's positive. Okay, so then you have to deal with it accordingly. So it's not, you can do a query at that time, but you will get notice from the MRO that there's a positive test. Okay, gas pipeline. So again, the pipeline does not fall under the FMCSA, and only drivers under the FMCSA are covered by this. Okay, so there's a question about employer responsibility to report this. They're on vacation, has gone more than 3 days when the results are received. How do we handle that? So how did you handle it in the past when someone had a violation and you were on vacation? You should have someone you designate to cover when you're away, because if someone has an accident and they need to have drug testing and it's positive, how did you handle that? There's no changes on how you do that. Okay. So again, to be clear, if an employee has a negative return to duty, we send that result in. We do not have to send in follow-ups, just that the program is complete. Once the program is complete and you're not required to have any follow-up tests, you just need to send the return to duty tests. And again, if there's a violation on any of the follow-up tests, then these will show up. Okay. All right. Okay, I think this comes to the end of our time, and I appreciate all your questions. And again, thank you for participating. We will send you a email to evaluate this presentation, And then once the presentation is loaded up on our website, we'll send you a link to that as well. So again, thank you for your participation.